Thanks so much, Don, and thanks for everybody for joining. Yes, Art Haywood, ADA president. Thanks for waving the hand, Jim Bishop. I'm so glad to be part of this ADA book discussion. It's an important contribution to help us understand the changes in our nation and how we can contribute to them. I just briefly met the author, and I spent the last several days reading Tio Bernie. And it is a fascinating book and story of influence, change, and what we need to do to create a progressive nation that generates some equality and justice for all. So I want to turn it back over to Don, but thank each of you for joining us this evening for this book discussion. And will not be the last one, but it's a great start. Thanks so much.
Excellent. Thank you, Art. Just wanted to give folks, a little bit of info about Chuck. He began his political career in his home state and mine as well, Texas, as a union member and a local officer before being hired on as a national political director of the steel workers, which is where I first met Chuck, and ADA began working with him on all sorts of fun things with the labor movement. He went on from there to create solidarity strategies, really building that on the concept of diversity, inclusion, mentorship of, and building out the next generation of minority professionals. And I know that following along as a colleague, this is a super valuable thing that Chuck's doing as far as bringing folks along and really doing that. And I know he'll touch on that. And his, along the way, whether it was within the labor movement or, with solidarity strategies, Chuck's worked on a range of campaigns, presidential, congressional, gubernatorial, and perhaps most recognizable, the two campaigns with Bernie Sanders, where, he got sort of a nice media profile talking about the campaign, whether you saw him on Fox News, but probably most of our crowd caught him on MSNBC, to be honest with you. This book that Chuck's going to talk about, Tio Bernie, it talks about those experiences and kind of how he came through it. I just wanted to share a few kind of notes, accolades, if you will, that came along with the book. Jeff Weaver, who was a longtime Bernie staffer and advisor on campaigns and so forth, says this is a true behind the scenes look at the Latino outreach operation and really Chuck's unique personal story of redemption through his personal journey to Bernie. Also, from the LBJ School of Public Affairs, Victoria DeFrancesco Soto. I think this points is an excellent, view into what Chuck has done here. Over 2 decades of studying Latino political outreach and mobilization, I can say without a doubt that the outreach Chuck developed and executed was historic. That being said, there's no one better to tell us about Chuck and the experiences laid out in the book than Chuck himself. Brother Chuck, the floor is yours.
Don, thank you so much. And Art, thank you for your kind words, and all of my sisters and brothers at the ADA who I've had a long history of working with and alongside in many of the struggles for civil rights, many of the struggles for democratic action. I see you, I lift you up, and know that many of you came before I ever came along to lead the way in progressive politics. And it's kind of part of the reason how this book came to fruition. I am not an author. My beautiful fiance would say that I should have changed the name of the book to be the first book that I ever read, I wrote. And that is not too far from the truth. I did want to lift up stories in the book to tell the story of the campaign and what happened behind the scenes of the campaign. But I think before you tell that story, I thought it was important, the way it came about was, if I back up, so we're in the heat of a presidential campaign primary in 2020. The coronavirus is upon us. We just won Nevada. We won more or less Iowa. We won New Hampshire. We get our butt whooped in South Carolina. The field consolidates and the whole race changes in 10 days. And then we're all sent home. And I'm told by Bernie and Jeff and Faz that now we have to shut the campaign down and it's over from my house. And I'll never forget the experience of how I lived through that and how sad I was. And I was sad because you didn't get to, all of you, and I can see by your faces and all your gray hair like I got on my face, that there's been a lot of campaigns that we've had to end. And when you end a campaign, you take those warriors, those young women and those young men who fight beside you, and you put them in a room and you tell them that we will live to fight another day, and you hug each other and you tell each other how well you did and the amazing accomplishments that you accomplished, even though you didn't win the race. There's so many more things that we won, but that opportunity was taken away from me. That opportunity was taken away from lots of folks on this campaign where you didn't get to look them in the face. You didn't get to cry with them. You didn't get to hug them and to tell them how good they did. And I'm not talking about 2 or 3 folks. There were 1,300 kids on this campaign. So I sat down and I wanted to tell the story. And it was kind of a way for me to deal with my grief and a way for me to deal with my exile of being by myself in my home, of how we pulled off what was deemed the unthinkable. Nobody would have ever thought we could have won 73% of the Latino vote in Nevada with a white Jewish Democratic Socialist from Vermont, which is not what naturally screams Latino icon. So I wanted to tell folks and open source how we did that so that other campaigns, other Democratic campaigns could take what we had showed would work to replicate that to win elections up and down the board. Now, some of my friends who run businesses would say, why would you just talk about this openly? Why wouldn't you put this in a vault and charge people thousands of dollars to hire you to teach them that? And I think that's where the real difference comes in is, sure, I have a business and sure, I need to make money and sure, I have made money. But I didn't get into this business to make money. I got into this business to be able to make money to pay for my staff, but I got in this business to win elections to make real social change in what I've seen. And that takes us to the beginning of the book. And in the beginning of the book, for several chapters, I tell the story of growing up in East Texas and who I am. Now, folks might say, well, you know, here you go. You're going to be this old boy starts talking about how good you are and how great you are and all the things you did when this is supposed to be about Bernie Sanders and Latino outreach. Well, I feel like it's important for folks to know in the beginning of the book about my story so they can see how vulnerable I can be, so they can see how unprepared I have been at different stages of my life and that I'm just human like everybody else and had made many mistakes. But it was the things along that story that I wanted some young Black girl, some young brown boy, some LGBT folks who hadn't come out of the closet, who are scared to death, people that are outside the norm of what we call the industrial political power in Washington, D.C., which is a select group of mainly white consultants who control all of the hierarchy within campaigns, to prove that it is possible, and that I proved that it was possible for a brown man who had a kid when I was a kid, who took full custody of that kid when I was 20 years old, when that kid was just a few months old, who worked in a factory, who's never been to college a day in his life, who's got a criminal record, who's had a truck repoed, and who's made a lot more mistakes than I have made successes. That should prove to any young man, young woman, or person out there that wants to work in the most senior levels of the campaign. If old Chuck Rocha can do it, then by God, they should be able to do it. If they went to a community college, if they got a degree, if they work hard, if they're fair with folks, if they're not an asshole. It's all of these life lessons that I wanted to intertwine into this book to say that it is possible. It is possible to do. And I kind of start the book by talking about, I'm looking here at the making of the Mexican redneck, which is, for those of you who don't know me, some of you on here know me really well and are part of my family, but others on here know that I'm self-described Mexican redneck because I think it describes both sides of my persona. Am I very much a Mexican? Yes. My father is, folks are from Guanajuato, Mexico. I'm a dark-skinned Latino kid, very, very Mexican. But I also was raised by my white grandparents, and my mama was white, and her folks were from Kentucky. My daddy left when I was almost 5, and I was raised on a working farm in a trailer house next to my white grandparents. So when I speak, my old white grandfather is coming out of my mouth. But when you look at me, my skin tone and the way that I carry myself, and I'm always cutting up, is my daddy to the bone. So that is who I am. I am Mexican, and I am very much a redneck. I am a Mexican redneck. And that Mexican redneck was made in the piney woods of East Texas, right outside of Tyler, Texas. And I tell this long story about having these two amazing grandmothers, my abuela Carmen and my mama, who was Evelyn Bussell, and how there was a reason why when I graduated high school, I weighed 310 pounds. It's because my white grandmother made the best fried chicken I'd ever laid my eyes on or smelt. And my grandmother, Carmen Rocha, made flour tortillas at every single meal with fresh homemade tortillas with butter. So I didn't go without a meal. We didn't have a lot of money, but I ate real good because I would just go back and forth between my two grandmothers' houses. Now that story just starts the evolution of saying I grew up as a multicultural kid, growing up playing football, growing up with a single mother. Then I go to work in this factory where I joined the union. And there's an important story in here about joining the union. I joined the union because everybody else joined the union. I was not an activist. I knew nothing about the union. I knew nothing about collective bargaining. And this is important for all of us, just like most of the other 19 or 20-year-old kids who are in a place where they join the union. They do it because everybody else is doing it. But it was about 6 or 8 months into that election or into that job that something happened that changed my life to put me here today, to make me be able to write a book, to be a New York Times contributor, to be on MSNBC, is when an old fella walked up to me and said, Chuck, we put up a sign up for a union steward on C team. That was the night shift that rotated second and third shift where all the kids and the new hires work because it was the crappiest shift to work on. And he said, do you want to be the union steward? I put up a sign-up sheet and none of you idiots even signed up to be the union steward. And I was like, Hank, I don't know nothing about no union and I don't know nothing about that contract. I said, you watched me play football for 4 years. I can't even hardly read and write. How am I going to be a union steward? Plus, I don't know if you know, me being a little bit of a smart ass, I was like, I just got the best job I ever had. I'm making $25 an hour, got Cadillac healthcare and a defined pension. I just bought a brand new pickup truck. What would I want to do messing around with some union thing when I'm out here making money and more than I've ever made in my entire life? He turned and looked at me and uttered a phrase that would change my life forever. And he said, and I quote, Chuck, if you become the union steward and you need to do union work, the union will pay somebody on overtime to come in and do your job for you so you can do your union work. And I was like, sign me up. That sounds like a thing I could do right there. You're going to pay me and I ain't got to work. So the lesson there is I did something that was very self-serving for me. I wasn't worried about the guys I worked with or the women I worked with or social justice or worried about the rights of the people. I was worried about Chuck Rocha be able to get off work early every Friday night on the evening shift where I could go to the shower before everybody else, so I could be at the club before everybody else, so I could get the first cold beer before everybody else. Now, that thing that was very self-serving to me opened up the door of activism to me. Because in the chapter, I talk about our activists born or our activists made. I always realized I was an activist that was made, that did have something deep down inside of me that I would discover via the union and being a union steward. And after I got older in life, it made much more sense than it did as a 21-year-old steward on C team in the Kelly Springfield tire plant. I became a really good union steward. And folks on here who know me know I literally love to fight in whichever way I can fight. And this opened me up to be able to fight with management and they couldn't fire me. And I could be and do all the things that I needed to do to protect my workers and the folks around me. And I got to be off work on Friday nights. And I got to mouth the supervisor who couldn't mess with me. And it was just like nirvana. I had found my place and my calling. And so this is where the doors open of doing more and being more involved. So then I start going to the union meetings, and then I start going to Democratic local meetings. And then I start hauling tables and chairs for the Central Labor Council meeting. And so as this kid who's 20, 21, 22, I'm learning about activism. Now I'll stop right there. Most people know me because I ran Bernie's campaign. Most people know me because they see me on TV or they see me in the New York Times or all the fancy things that I get to do. But the reason I just told you that story is I started at the bottom, at the very bottom of campaigning, where I was a union steward. I put up signs, I knocked on doors, I did phone calls. My first race was Ann Richards, you may have heard of, a lovely woman who was the governor of Texas.
And I was her East Texas volunteer coordinator. She paid me gas money and sandwich money, and I got to put up signs. Thought it was the best thing ever. But it was those experiences of growing up with a single mother, understanding what government cheese was because I had it, understanding what a payday lender was because I'd used it, understood what it was like to get your truck repoed several years later because it had happened to me, and starting at the bottom of campaigns gave me a unique understanding of real people, gave me a unique understanding of how campaigns really work. I work in an industrial political complex now in Washington, D.C. that are controlled by over 445 different political consulting firms, all of them run by elite groups of folks who are wonderful people, nothing against them, but they all run the same campaign because they've all read the same book and they all run it the same way. There's no nuances for young Black people. There's no nuances for Latinos. If they want to start talking about Black folks, they'll start talking about criminal justice reform. If they're going to talk to Latinos, they'll start talking about immigration. And there's just a disconnect on culturally competent campaigns that are run in today's modern age, much less the segmentation of how you deliver that message through a multi-layered paid communication. And I know I'm talking fast and it's confusing, but it's as easy as we should be sending digital ads to young folks and running TV commercials on The Price is Right because Mama and Papa are going to watch that every night after the local news because we just know that. So I lay that out in the beginning of this book. And we go into how I start going out and running campaigns, and then how I start, building out the Steelworkers Political Department, go through different mistakes that I'd made in my life, and then lead to starting this firm. This is where the big changes happen in this book, is when I leave the union after being the political director for 11 years, I know that there's one thing that working at the senior levels of campaigns is happening and what I don't see. Because I, at that point, as a political director of a union, getting to be the most powerful rooms in the country because I have a checkbook for the union. So they let me in because we're writing checks to congressmen and senators. You get to go to the boxes at the NFL games and go on the golf tournaments and all of that. But every time I'm around those things, I'm always looking around. And all of us are some of the same ways. You always look for somebody from your state or maybe somebody else in the cowboy hat or somebody else from Pittsburgh. There never was very many Black folks, very many brown folks, very few women in the 90s either. And when I left the union, I wanted to do something to create more space for those folks because now I'm looked at back then as a senior operative. And what could I do within my personal validation to create space for people of color to get into campaigns? Because I quickly realized that the reason there were not more Black and brown folks in campaigns weren't that they weren't no good or that even anybody was racist. Nobody was racist. My God, there was wonderful people fighting for the rights of Black and brown folks. It was that there wasn't a point of entry into campaigns for poor Black kids or poor brown kids, or for that matter, poor white kids who didn't know nobody. Because politics is one of the few things that's still built around who you know and what school you went to and what hierarchy you're part of. So if you're a upper middle class white kid from the suburbs of Philadelphia, you or somebody your daddy plays golf with probably knows somebody around some congressional office where you can get a free internship on Capitol Hill to start that evolution of your career. Well, Chuck Rocha hadn't even been to college. I didn't even know how to spell Congress. I didn't know how many congressmen there was back then. I couldn't have found Germany on a map if you would have asked me to. I probably can't today, to be honest with you, but I digress. But how are we going to open up more ways for folks to get in? So I created a consulting firm that started servicing people like the ACLU and the Communication Workers Union and CWA. They were paying me to do their mail, their TV, their radio. And so we created kind of like an incubator where if you were a poor Black or brown kid and came to Washington, D.C., you could get a job at Solidarity, which is the name of my firm. And I'd give you a computer, a workspace, and pay you a stipend every week and your bus fare or metro fare and pay you enough money to live on if you could find a place to stay. And in the last 11 years, and this will be my legacy, not Bernie Sanders, not how beautiful my fiance is, not how I'm funny talking, like all the things that people know about me. It's about how many kids' lives you have changed. And today there's 110 young Black and brown kids who've come through my firm, 110. And I've proven that diversity, inclusion, and equality is possible when you're intentional about doing it. And I needed to prove what could happen. And that jumps right back to the book in Bernie Sanders. Bernie hired me in 2016 to help him do work. And I did some mail and my firm did a bunch of work for him. I wasn't truly an advisor.
Like I couldn't call Bernie on the cell phone in 16. I was working for Jeff and for mainly Jeff Weaver, who was managing it. And by the time the 20 campaign comes around, you know, we realize how we want to build out the campaign. And I write in the book something that was very hard and a very hard decision that goes back to everything happens for a reason. And I write in the book about Jeff. We built out the campaign for over a year before we announced, you know, making sure that if he got ready to run, we were ready to move on day one. There's been articles written about it, but I take you behind the scenes of meetings with Bernie prior to our announcement. It's in December. I remember this because I was going to Cuba for my birthday. And right before I left, Jeff come over to the house, and he had me in charge of finding people to hire for manager and political director. So I'm interviewing all these possible staffers because I'm going to be in charge of building out the campaign. And we had interviewed 4 or 5 folks to be the manager, really with an eye towards people of color and women. We want to get past this whole Bernie bro thing and really be really reflective of the community at large. And when he sat down and he said, look, I talked to Bernie, and we want to know if you'd be interested in just running this thing. And I was just I just took a step back, and I was like, I'd never even thought about me running it. And I write about this in the book, and how over a week or two, you know, how I struggled with what I was going to do, you know, and I have a good support system around me. I have a woman who loves me. I have a family who loves me. Like I was talking to lots of folks about what should I do? I knew I had a once in a lifetime opportunity to do something no other brown or black person had really done, which is run a presidential campaign. And I'd make history for folks forever. But I write about a guy named Tim Tagaris calling me on the phone one night, and him saying, and he was the guy who raises all the money for Bernie. He is the guy who does all the digital fundraising, who has raised Bernie Sanders over $500 million in $27 contributions. He's really good. And he's a Marine. He's the salt of the earth, no ego, just one of the nicest men I've ever known. So I trust him when he calls me. And he's my friend. So he wants what's best for me too. And he said, Chuck, you should know that there's 1 million people on the internet who would walk over hot coals for Bernie Sanders. They love him, and they love him with every fiber of their being, and they will love you. And you'll get a lot more Twitter followers, and they will sing your praises. And he said, you should also know that there's 1 million people on the internet that hate Bernie's guts. And that in return, they'll hate your guts. And there's nothing you can do to make any difference. They'll talk crap about you on the internet. They'll probably even make up stuff about you on the internet. And it just sat with me for a while because I had spent 10 years at that point building this firm I was telling you about and training 100 kids to work for me. I thought back on my criminal record past and how I'd overcome that. I thought about overcoming being a single father. I thought about all these young black and brown kids who rely on me today and then for an income. And if somebody was to hurl some false accusation at me that because I had a past record or because I didn't have a perfect life or because of whatever, it would harm all these folks around me that I love, my son, my mother, my fiance, my kid, like all the things. And I was just like, it's just not worth it. No matter how much personal pleasure I would get out of it, knowing I could do it. I write about that being the hardest decision I ever made, but probably being the best decision that I ever made. And when you think back on those times in your life, that's why I wrote it down and put it there so folks would know that also struggle with hard decisions, right? And I would go on to cut a deal with Bernie and with the senator and say, look, I'll find you. You need a Boy Scout. You need a Girl Scout to be a manager. You need somebody with a family who's never been in trouble, who ain't even had a speeding ticket, who will be quiet and fly around with Bernie and not be a loudmouth like somebody else we all know, me. And I'll run the campaign. I will set up the states. I'll hire the staff. I'll do the TV. I'll do the blocking and tackling that you need to do to win it. Hire some good Christian salt of the earth man or woman who needs to just be that person. It's not me. And we found that person. He was the first Muslim American campaign manager, fast, secure, who literally I could throw a rock from my house and hit his. He lives on the next block from here. The nicest human. He don't cuss. I ain't never seen him drink a drop. I don't even think he drinks coffee. And he's just the nicest fella. And so I was like, perfect. First Muslim American manager, good dude, family, 2 little beautiful girls, amazing wife.
And then it all starts. And then after about a month of watching what he had went through, just in the first month, I was like, oh, sweet baby Jesus, I made the right decision, because I would have already gotten fired by popping off to somebody or hitting somebody or telling Bernie to hang it in his butt. Like something I would have done that would have been bad, because I can't keep my mouth shut sometimes. Bernie or somebody would have fired me right away. So we had hired the right person. All of these stories are in there, and I don't mean to take so much time on that one story. The last thing I'll say, and then I want to open it up to questions, is there's lots of personal stuff in the book. There's lots of things about, if you're a campaign nerd and you love campaigns, read it. It tells you how we did what we did in Iowa, how I snuck up on them in Iowa, how we were worried about South Carolina, how we got this amazing Latino outreach operation done. And a lot of these have behind the scenes stories. And now that you've heard me talk, my good friends say that when they read the book, they can hear me talking in the book, which is probably the greatest compliment. But I walked through the day that Bernie Sanders had a heart attack. We called it at the time a heart episode, but it was one of the scariest, saddest days, and days with an S, of my life. And I talk about what it was like behind the scenes. I talk about how disgusting reporters were with the questions that they were asking and the way that they had weighed in. I talk about what the staff was going through. I talk about what I was going through. I talk about how I literally shut the campaign down 3 times, because keep in mind, we've got a manager, we have all these managerial pieces, but Chuck Rocha more or less is in charge. So I can stop TV ads, I can pull mail back, I can freeze interviews, I'm in charge of the budget. Like, I had unbelievable power, and I see my privilege for being able to do that. But over 3 days, I shut down the campaign 3 times and started it back up 3 times. And how that call to AOC, from AOC to Bernie in the hospital bed that night, was a big, big factor in us being able to continue the campaign. And I walked through all of these emotions and walked through me having a breakdown in front of the staff in a staff meeting, trying to explain to everybody what had just went on and that he's going to be okay. Because at that point, he wasn't running for president. He was like our father and our grandfather. And we were worried about his well-being. Who could give a damn if he was going to be able to be in the race or not? I sure didn't. I just wanted him to be okay, because we loved Bernie, just like we love anybody that you spend that much time with trying to help, right? So a lot of these stories are in the book, about like these personal stories about what everybody always wants to know, what goes on behind the scenes, right? And they don't understand all the nuances of campaigns. And in this book, I try to break it down and talk about everything that's there. Now, most people know that I get all the credit for all of the successes that Bernie had, especially around the Latino stuff. But in the back of the book, I made it a point, and I wouldn't have wrote the book any other way. In the back of the book is the names, first and last name, of every single Latino who was hired on this campaign, because the book is about the Latino outreach operation, more or less, in my story. So I wanted to make sure that all of them got their credit in the book, because it wasn't just Chuck Rocha. It was over 300 other young Latinos who actually were out doing the work every day that were the success behind that book. I just get to be the funny guy in the cowboy hat on the front of it. I'm going to wrap up there, Don, and make sure that I have plenty of time for folks to ask any questions that they may have about, what went on with the campaign or the book.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you, Chuck, for getting that going and sharing that. I think it's great, by the way, that you've talked so much about your experience. I think it really sets it up and makes it real for folks. That's how we connect in the organizing and campaign work that we do. You got to understand who people are, and who you are if you're going to be successful, frankly. And so I appreciate that you do that as a setup. I have dropped into the chat some links, some things that Chuck talked about. So tioberniebook.com, that's an easy to remember URL, but it's for you in the chat there. Also, Chuck talked quite a bit about his consulting firm, Solidarity Strategy. So I put that link in there. I wanted folks to, I think the cleanest way to do it, certainly you can raise your hand, but if you put questions into the chat, we can also just take questions through the chat as well. I'm going to take the privilege of having the microphone and ask one up front here. What do you see for the next, the next campaign, as far as certainly you and what Bernie was doing, particularly in outreach to younger folks, particularly Latino folks, you made some good ground up on that. And what's the sort of next thing that you see for the next cycle? I try to, whether it's trying not to have it go backwards or move forward, kind of what are some of the things that you're seeing right now developing in that lane?
The single most important thing about this election that's coming up is one thing, and that is there was a whole lot of new people that voted in 2020. A whole lot of new people who voted for Joe Biden, but also a whole lot of people. 7 million more Republicans showed up to vote for Donald Trump than showed up in 2016. Let that sink in. 7 million more crazy Republicans showed up to vote for him. Luckily, a few more showed up for Joe Biden that hadn't voted in the last election. But the key here is this, is that there was a ton of folks who hadn't voted in 18 or 16 who just showed up. Now, I know, and any of you who've done politics for more than 30 seconds know that if you hadn't voted in the last two elections, you probably weren't on any targeted mailing list. You weren't on any prime target list for digital advertising. So you just showed up. And in my mind, and from doing focus groups, I know that that's two kinds of folks who really hated Donald Trump. They showed up to vote against him, or folks that love Donald Trump that showed up to vote for him. There wasn't a whole lot of folks that Joe Biden was motivating to show up because they love them some Joe Biden. They were already part of the folks who always vote in every election. Nothing against Joe Biden. It's just that that's how polarizing Donald Trump was. And a lot of us were in that same train. So how do we get those folks back? How do we get those Democrats back who voted for a Democrat, even though they weren't voting for Joe Biden, to vote in an off-year election where the majority in the Senate and the House is up for re-election? And do Republicans show up in that level without Donald Trump on the top of the ballot? Now, Georgia, where I worked in the runoff, would prove that there was a couple 100,000 of those who didn't show up. So there was some drop-off without him on the ballot. But I'd also say in places like McAllen, Texas, in Hidalgo County, where Trump had overperformed Biden compared to Hillary by 21 points. 58,000 new Latinos voted in Hidalgo County who hadn't voted in the last two elections. And about 70% of them who are registered Democrats and model Democrats, Don, because it's an 80% Democratic county, voted for, guess it, Donald Trump. So this is the thing that keeps me up at night as we head into the midterms, is who shows up, and will we do the work early and often enough to actually get those Democrats back and give them a reason to vote? And is just reelecting Nancy Pelosi to be the speaker enough? It's enough for good yellow dog Democrats like all of us. But what about that middle of the road factory worker, Black, brown, Asian, just that who got shot, who got some COVID relief, who likes this infrastructure plan, but is that enough to get them back? So that's what Don's, making my hair fall out.
Well, unfortunately, it's done a good job there for you on the hair front. Let me get for John Seeley's got his hand up. John, can you unmute yourself and ask your question, please?
Well, I appreciate your book, although I haven't read it. I've been very concerned about the swing of Latinos towards Trump, which was, we heard about very early the Cubans in Miami. Then we heard about the Rio Grande Texans, which, they had their oil issues. But then I look at California vote, and the areas that swing to Trump are a lot of working class Latino areas that I don't know whether you know, like Bell and Maywood and and that's, true across the state, and seemingly, Pew says in Nevada also. I mean, do you have some thoughts about what is prompting some, swing towards Trump despite the all his anti-immigrant comments? And do you have any idea who's doing good research on that topic?
John, thank you so much for the question. And I've got so much information on this topic because it's the bane of my existence. I probably could write a second book about it. So after the election, I was just like you, John. It was so concerning to me. I needed to know why this happened. So I went in and spent about $40,000. I should say that I run the nation's largest Latino super PAC that I just started after we stopped the Bernie campaign. So I wanted a way to continue to talk to Latinos to try to get them out for Joe Biden, because I didn't believe Joe Biden or the DNC would do it. So I wanted to create a PAC and just do it myself if they weren't. And I ended up raising about $9 million and doing a bunch of work in Nevada, Arizona, Pennsylvania, Michigan, to Latino voters, and North Carolina. So when I got done, I tell you that to say that we spent a bunch of money to go have a bunch of conversations with Latinos in Miami-Dade and in the Texas Valley. I interviewed over 1,800 Latinos in English and Spanish. And then I went back and looked to see where the money was spent and how the money was spent. And John, more importantly, how soon did they start Spanish language advertising as just one of the criteria to measure the effectiveness of what they were doing compared to what I knew Donald Trump was doing. And the bottom line is Democrats across the board failed to start early enough talking to Latinos. They failed across the board to have conversations with Latinos outside of any battleground state. And what that means is, I'll give you one example, John, and the rest of you who are all political animals, I know half of you, is that in Miami-Dade, in just the last 30 days, John, and this is just something I wanted to find something to measure, with Spanish language TV and radio commercials by every Democrat, Joe Biden, the congressional races, the last 30 days in Miami-Dade, there was $15 million spent in just Spanish language TV and radio in just 30 days. Now, in that same 30-day period, the Republicans had only spent $6 million, literally half, less than half of the Democrats. While keep in mind, Republicans had overperformed what they had done in that county as compared to Hillary Clinton by 21 points. So you say to yourself, well, Chuck, you and all these organizers have told me for years, whoever spends the most money normally is going to have the biggest realm. And you're just saying that the Republicans, who got outspent 2-1 the last 30 days, outperformed Democrats by 21 points. Well, what I found is that the Democrats had really only spent that money in the last 6 weeks at that level, while the Republicans had been spending money for 6 months down there talking to Latinos in Spanish. That's one reason. The second reason is they ran this undercover misinformation campaign in Spanish to Latinos on YouTubes and on Facebook and on WhatsApp and Instagram, messaging apps, which had some effect. You had COVID where nobody could knock on doors person to person for Democrats, while Republicans never stopped knocking on people's doors. That had some effect. So you couple all of those things together, then you start seeing this big swing. That's Florida. In Texas, it was almost the same thing. No Democrat was doing anything in Texas because there was no real races in the Valley. There's no contested general race except for the top of the ticket. The Democratic super PACs come flying in the last 4 weeks and spent $1.8 million on Spanish language TV, John, while the Republicans had only spent $30,000 on Spanish language TV and still outperformed by 28 points the Democrats. Because guess what? They had been canvassing for 6 months. They had on-the-ground operations for 6 months. They had been doing caravans and doing all of these things where the Democrats hadn't really done anything down there, and the local congressional races weren't doing anything. We found no spending in the Texas Valley because all of the Democratic congressional representatives down there are in safe districts, so they spent zero money in their reelect, and that's why all of them almost got beat, because they didn't run any election. And in California, it's the combination of the two. If you weren't in a targeted congressional seat in California, you probably weren't getting any advertising. There wasn't a Senate race. There wasn't a governor's race. And in the targeted congressional races in California, where we did this in-depth research, in places like Gil Cisneros' race in Orange County, that is 33% Latino, and him and the DCCC and the House Majority PAC spent $0 on Spanish language advertising. Zero. In places like California 25 in Northern LA, they spent $1 million on Spanish language in the last 3 weeks, and that was about it. It's an afterthought. Like they're not building long-term. I talk extensively about this in the book. There's 3 key reasons that Bernie Sanders won the Latino vote dramatically. Is the timing. We started at least 8 months in all of these states in advance of the first communication in Spanish. Targeting, that meant expanding the targeting outside of just prime voters out to infrequent voters and newly registered voters. And then the cultural competency of the way you deliver the message. Facebook, Twitter, Pandora,
TV, radio, Spanish language newspapers. We did all of that. None of these other campaigns were doing a layered approach like that. So I'm glad you asked that. And I'm sorry to take such a long-winded answer, but it's literally what I've been living with now for the last 6 months, John.
Yeah, well, that's a good answer. Although, look to change that strategy going forward. Thinking about sort of strategy going forward, we've got fighting and not sure how many of them are going to make it through, but the voter suppression laws popping up all over the country. They affect everyone in some way, but there's certainly outsized effect on different communities, minority communities, and so forth as far as access. Kind of what are your thoughts on that? What are some things that groups like ADA and others can do to sort of navigate around some of that, the voter suppression?
Well, thank you, Don. You're exactly right that these laws are affecting folks of color and poor folks in general. Anybody who doesn't drive a car, if you're taking mass transportation, yada, yada. Like, I think that empowering, like this new Texas bill, that's just crazy, where you empower poll watchers. And when you tell voters about this stuff, they're like, what? It's almost like they don't believe it, that it could be real. They're like, in Texas, voters are telling me in focus groups, we couldn't keep our electricity on last winter because of an ice storm, and they're taking our tax dollars at the state legislature and think the priority is limiting days for early votes is what we should be doing. Like, voters get that piece of it, but they also get the piece of on the opposite side. So they're like, sure, you should have an ID, and sure, you should show that. Like, they don't really get all the nuances if they live in the suburbs and in a big house, why everybody should have a driver's license when they don't realize everybody don't drive a car. So I think education is the big part of this, because when you ask voters, what are the issues that drive them, this whole piece about voter ID, whether you like it or not, and this is not a popular answer with this group, but voters don't care. Like, they care about how they're going to feed their family. The two main answers I've been getting in focus groups is they're concerned with the price of gas and the price of bread. That's real talk. That's what they're dealing with. They don't care if their neighbor don't get a chance to go vote because they ain't got a driver's license. What they care about is how they're going to feed their family every day, and how much more is groceries going to go up, because that's one more or less thing that they got to, spend some money on. So educating folks on how it's those people who are trying to take advantage of us people is always a good argument.
Got a couple questions in the chat here. I want to make sure I don't miss anything. So I don't miss it. I know that our president, Art Haywood, had a question about actually, I think you're going to be better. Can you go off of mute, Art, and ask your question? You did a better job framing it before we started than what I'm seeing in the chat.
Yeah, thanks so much. Looking to 2030 and the demographic changes that we're going to have in the nation, I'm looking a lot at this concept called the New American Majority, and just like to get your forecast of how we prepare for 2030.
I like to start this conversation, Art, by saying demographics are not destiny. And I think that we have put in so much faith in how more multicultural and how much more diverse the American electorate is becoming, and it is. And we are gaining systematically because of that as Democrats, but not near at the level we should be based off of that growth. In Texas, when Ann Richards was the governor and I worked for her, 70% of the kids in public schools back then were white. Today, only 27% of public school kids in Texas are white, and it's still as Republican as it was when Ann Richards was the governor, right? You would think that demographic explosion would have changed Texas, but it hasn't. And to your point about what 30 looks like, and this is I'm going to beat around the bush here, but I'm now getting you your answer, which is as these young Black and brown and multicultural kids are coming of age, because we have done campaigns the same way since Barack Obama, going back about 10 years of what we call data-driven campaigns, where we're using analytics, modeling, and algorithms to tell us who has the highest, stay with me here, propensity to vote and who is most persuadable. What those kind of algorithms and targeting does is leaves out huge swaths of young Black and brown kids because they're not prime voters. And a lot of times they're not in a household that has a prime voter. So what that leads to, Art, is what you're seeing in Florida and Texas, where you have the majority of 18-year-olds who are registering to vote are not registering as Democrat or Republican because they don't know what they are. So they're registering as no party preference. So if we don't change that, 2030 is going to look way different than what we all expect it to be just based off of pure demographics. We have to do and fundamentally change the way between now and 2030 that we are talking to people. Donald Trump should have taught a lot of Democrats a few things that Democrats in this town are too prideful or too stupid to understand, which is you got to be a carnival barker sometime about what you are doing. Like too many times, and Barack Obama was bad about this, is bringing a policy book to a boxing match. Like we are right on all the policies, but we are in a fist fight. And Donald Trump would just talk about fighting and dance around the ring, but never would really get in it. But he'd be hollering from the outside about how he's going to whoop you. Remember that guy in high school? To where everybody thought he was real tough because he talked about how he was going to whoop everybody, but never really got in a fight. And if you probably hit him one good time, he wasn't going to be around no more. We got to get a little bit of that as Democrats. We got to get a little more prideful. We got to get a little tougher, and we got to get a little meaner. And I've been saying this a lot, and I've been prefacing to people, especially young men, that you can be tough and you can be mean without being sexist and without being an idiot. Like I'm a big old boy, and I am mean and I am tough, but I am not sexist and I'm not an idiot. You can do both, Democrats, and showing that, saying, I'm not this and I don't stand for that. And he is lying. And this is who we are. We are with the working folks, and we ain't going to stand in a Chinese suit and talk about jobs in America. We're going to talk about a plan for jobs in America and investing in these American school kids and making sure that we have places for folks to work. And these kind of things that we've allowed the Republicans to steal from our party that are our values and still not their values. We've just conceded the talking point. So those are the things I think that needs to be changed for 2030 to be truly what me and you think they should be.
Great. A couple of questions that had a similar, I guess, point. I'm going to try to put them together. You talk a lot about in the book about, and you preface that in your discussion, intentional hiring and mentorship of, minority campaign staff, and how, and you're absolutely right, because I experienced this myself. You got, well-off white folks running all these things, yet what we're going to have to do, changing demographics, the reality of campaigns, and what we damn well should be doing anyway, is, not just talking to, but engaging, brown folks. So, how do we as an organization and as the sort of left at large be more intentional about engagement and hiring, to move forwd? And it seems like a simple answer, but clearly it's not, or it would be doing more. We'd be doing a lot more of it if it was easier.
I think that Art's part about what 2030 looks like and the changing demographic gives this organization and lots of organization an excuse, which you don't need an excuse, especially this group, to call the question. Is that if we're going to spend money talking to Black, brown, or poor white voters, we should be making sure that the consultants and the folks that we use have some cultural competency. And cultural competency is not just knowing what the Black neighborhood looks like or sounds like when you walk up in it. It ain't like knowing what a Latino neighborhood is and the difference between a Cuban and a Mexican in East LA, which is all very cultural competent. But it's also the cultural competency of walking into a poor white neighborhood in East Texas where I grew up, right? Like nobody's talking to any of those folks. And so if you have a consultant who also works at the DNC, who went to Harvard, who does great consulting, who worked for Barack Obama, and who's gotten away, but just because they work for Barack Obama, getting all the business that they want, because a lot of us, how do I say this? A lot of us try to validate our existence by who we hire because of the peer pressure of our peers. And let me go a little more in depth with that. Back to John's question. As another part of my research, John, after the last election, I went back to look at how many consulting firms worked on top congressional, Senate, and the presidential super PACs that were owned by people of color.
And then I went and looked at the campaign managers of every House race, Senate race, and governor's race. And what I disgustingly found was what I thought I would find, which is less than 1% of the $2 billion that was spent in super PACs were spent on firms that were owned by Black or brown people. Less than 1%. Just 1% wasn't even spent on Black or brown for all the money that was spent. And it went to the same 10 consulting firms. And again, fine people, know them, they do good work, but they all went to great schools. They're all connected with somebody who runs one of the party committees. They've just been part of this apparatus, right? And when you looked at the campaign managers of Congress, the top 30 congressional races, and you looked at all the Senate managers, including Warnock, including other folks, every campaign manager was a white woman or a white man. Again, nothing against white women or white men. My mama is a white woman. I'm just saying, if we are going to beat the drum around diversity and inclusion and having a more culturally competent way to run campaigns that are connected to people, I would argue, if you went and looked at the white kids running all those campaigns, that very few of them came from poor families either, right? Like, I think that's why I always like to distinguish working class white folks who have struggled a lot, right? No different than my family. But there's not a point of entry for that poor white kid or that poor black kid to get into that manager spot, right? Now, what you're seeing now is the party committees who are taking a lot of heat from ADA or from the Hispanic caucus or the Black caucus are starting to do more to diversify the party committees themselves. But that's not seen on the ground at the campaign level, who still fall under the same peer pressure of hiring the right white consultant or the right manager who worked for the right whatever campaign. This is the underbelly of our vulnerability that nobody talks about. We want to talk about return on investment and how much cost per vote and all this analytic rhythm around fitting your campaign in the box that everybody's supposed to run, while we're leaving a lot of cultural competency to the side, huge amounts of people that we're not talking to, and there's no Black or brown folks in the room, so you can't be surprised when they think that vote and that stuff has to happen at the last minute in a half-hearted effort. Sorry about that.
Excellent.
That's kind of my jam.
Okay. That's why we asked. I wanted to see if there was anything else here question-wise before we wrap up. I appreciate your passion, and I hope that everyone else here is seeing that. It is you are you, Chuck, and but it's important, and I love it. Thank you for enjoying for sharing your experience and your passion, your knowledge with us tonight. We look forward to sharing this with others going forward, and looking forward to working with you in the years to come, Chuck.
And I want to thank everybody for having me, and a special thank you to Amy who reached out to me to set this up. I wouldn't have been here if Amy Isaacs hadn't asked me to be here and reached out to me and helped walk me through making sure this was on my schedule and that everything was in line. And so y'all have a good one, and Amy, who ran all the traps on this. And, I'd ask you all to follow me on social media, on Twitter or on Facebook at Chuck Rocha, where I talk about this stuff a lot and hold people accountable a lot. I was on a conference call this morning with a group of folks who are trying to shut down federal prisons. And one of my friends who served 12 years in the federal pen, who's now working at the DCCC, who we worked together on criminal justice reform, said, Chuck Rocha, and I quote him because it made me feel humble. He said, Chuck Rocha is good enough where he attacks everybody on Twitter, but he's so good that they end up having to hire him if they want to win. So that was the greatest compliment I had ever gotten in my life from a fellow brother. And so I don't mind calling folks out, but I'm also here about getting results. I think that you should bring as many solutions as you do complaints to a party. I got lots of complaints, but I also got lots of solutions. And the only thing I need more of is more friends. And tonight I felt like I made a bunch more friends here, and I look forward to when we can all get together in person.
Thank you. Good night, Chuck. Good night, everyone. Thank you.